Galatians 6:9. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. Galatians 6:9. Very good. All right, so today we've got an adventurous task. I must be honest with you, a very adventurous task. We're going to cover 6 books of the Bible all in one Sunday. Now, what that means is, yeah, I know some of you are like, we're going to be here till dinner time. Yes, we very much could if we got into great detail, but I'm going to trust or ask you to go back at home in your spare time and read through 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It spans about 60 plus chapters and around 500 years of time. 1 Samuel opens in around 1050 BC, somewhere around in there, and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles both end in around 586 or a little bit after 575 AD. So roughly almost 500 years between the first verses of 1 Samuel and the last verses of Kings and Chronicles. And so 500 years, 6 books, 100, I said 60 plus, it's 167 chapters, And so if you want to, I was trying to figure out how to summarize, just kind of get us into the message. And so here's kind of how I think it may be best to understand it, because we're only going to really do like a 30,000 foot view of all of these books. There's a lot that's going on. There's a lot of cool stories and learning points throughout the entire book, those 6 books. But here's kind of the 30,000 foot view. If you were to kind of look at all of these books together, you would really see the rise and decay of an empire. In 1 Samuel, I think if you were to give it kind of a subtitle, it would be The Rise of an Empire. 2 Samuel, I've kind of given the subtitle of the Golden Age, because it is like the pinnacle between 2 Samuel and 1 Kings and 1 Chronicles, a few pages in there. It's really the Golden Age of the Israelite Empire, right? And then by the time you get more into 1 Kings and more into 1 Chronicles, it's kind of the decline of the empire. And then by the time you get to 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, it is truly decay and exile. And so what you have at the rise of an empire in 1 Samuel, by the end of this 500-year block, it truly is exile, meaning that the Israelites are taken out of their home and they are literally in a train of people marched hundreds of miles away. 2 tragic events, and these are only 2 things we'll kind of give you a little bit more detail on. By the end of the book, what happens is both Israel's divided at this time. They've had a civil war and a coup, and half the nation is considered the northern kingdom, and the other part's considered the southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom goes, I want you to hear this today, okay? We can spend our entire Sunday here this morning, but we won't. The northern kingdom make up 10 tribes. And they're called Israel in the Bible, or Manasseh, or Ephraim when you're reading the prophets. And later on, they kind of go by Israel, Manasseh, or Ephraim, and kind of name. And literally, they get taken over by the Assyrians. I want you to listen to this. The Assyrians take them away into exile, and they never come back as a unit. I want you to think about that for a minute. Now, there are sporadic people who make it out and come back, but as a group of 10 tribes, they never come back. They're lost to history. Wiped out. They're assimilated in other nations, and they never come back. Judah and Benjamin make up the southern kingdom, called the kingdom of Judah. They too are taken away a few hundred years later by the Babylonians and then by the Persians, and they make it back. But at the end of these two, this kind of section of history for Israel is very tragic and very bad. But it offers for us a lot of key ideas or learning points for our life, so that hopefully we don't end up in the same place that they do. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to use one story at the very beginning of Samuel that kind of is it's very personal to the person who writes it. It's actually a song or a poem. And it's very personal to the person who writes it. It's very near, but it also is very transcendent in the fact that if you use this poem, it really serves as like glasses or contacts or a lens through which you can view the next 500 years of the Israelite history. And you see there's two truths we're going to pull out. You see these two truths play out over and over and over and over and over, right? So let's read 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Our poem, our song comes not from a king or really a notable figure in history and what society would say would be a notable figure, but it comes from a mother, Hannah, who does a remarkable task or has a remarkable story. We'll read a prayer. I'll give you a little bit of detail about her in a second. 1 Samuel 2, 1 through 2. And Hannah prayed and said, Hannah prayed and said, my heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts up the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. For he will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. That's key. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. So what we have here is the song or poem of a mother. Now here's kind of a little bit of the backstory of Hannah. Hannah, she was married to this guy named Elkanah. And Elkanah had 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Peninnah was blessed with fertility and had a lot of children. Hannah, on the other hand, could not have kids. And so in a fit of grief and all the emotion, every year they went to the tabernacle of the Lord to pray. And so she was praying and praying and praying so feverishly with tears and all this that the priest literally thought she was wasted, like she was drunk. And she said, oh no, I'm just praying that the Lord will give me a child. And the Lord does. Miraculously gives Hannah a child. Our poem comes not after she has the child, but 3 years later. 2.5 to 3 years later. Because at that point, Hannah had said, Lord, if you'll bless me with a child, I will give that child back to you. And that's what she does. She in turn takes Samuel, her son, and gives him to the priest Eli at the time to be a servant of the Lord in the tabernacle and the worship center for Israel. And that's what Samuel does. And Samuel becomes a huge figure throughout these. He has 2 books that bear his name, and he becomes a hugely important transitional figure for Israel. But it is in this song by his mother that two crystal clear points reveal themselves, and they literally dominate the rest, or not they, but the ideas that come out of them dominate the rest of Israelite history for the next 500 years. I'm going to give those 2 points to you, then we're going to kind of wrap that up into some application, and then we'll end with some challenges for us today. Here's the first point. In verse number 3, and I'll read it again, read this part again. Here's what Hannah says. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. And so the idea here is that the Lord knows what's going on. He knows what's going on in your heart. He knows what's going on in your mind. He knows that there's nothing outside of the knowledge of God. Like he is, the word that we would use today is that, he's all-knowing. three omni words that we like to use in theological circles. He's omnipresent. That means he's everywhere. He's omnipotent or omnipotent, however you want to split it up. I don't know what Pastor Joe, what the correct way to say it is, but that means he's all powerful. He can do anything. But the last one is he's omniscient. That means he's all knowing. That means there's nothing outside the knowledge of God. Like there's not a secret that you have that God doesn't know about, right? That is both good and scary all at the same time. And what Hannah is saying here is that this is the God that Israel serves. He is all-knowing. He knows the depths of your depravity. He knows the good things that you've done and everything in between. He knows. Right? Hannah goes on to say that as a result, he knows the difference, and this will be huge, huge for the next 500 years. He knows the difference between pride and humility. And what she's saying here, if you go back and read over it, you see there are multiple times where those who are hungry they're not hungry anymore, but the ones who are filled, they lack. And she goes back and forth between the proud and the humble, the proud and the humble. And what we see is, if we could kind of sum this idea up, I think we could best do it by quoting James 4:6 and 1 Peter 5:5. They say the exact same thing. And they are both quoting or reiterating a point that Solomon makes in Proverbs 3:34. And here it is. So this is James 4:6, 1 Peter 5:5. Both of them say the same thing. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. And so what Hannah is saying here is that God blesses those who are humble, and he opposes, he pushes back, he resists those who are proud. Let me give you one example. There are literally dozens we could pull from over these 500 years. Let me give you one, and this may be familiar to a lot of you. If it's not, it'll be familiar now. Here's the story. It's from David's life. David was the model king for Israel. He was, during that golden age, David was the king. And so David becomes the person for which every king after him is judged. In fact, as you get into Kings and Chronicles, Kings especially, every king has an epitaph at the end of their life. And it either goes one of two ways. Okay? They did right in the sight of the Lord and followed after David, their father. Right? Or the other one is, they did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow after the ways of their father David. Those are the only two epitaphs. Right? That's it. You either did right or you did evil. Period. End of the story. Right? Now, does that mean the ones who did right were perfect? No. And in Kings and Chronicles and Samuel clearly show that all of these kings are far from perfect. David, though, however, is the model for what a king should be like. In fact, later on, he is described as a man after God's own heart. The only person in Scripture that is described that way. But a tragic event happens in 2 Samuel 11. Here's how I'm going to give you the highlights of the story. David should be at war, but he's not. Then David sees a woman. Then he takes the woman, abuses the woman. Then when she is found to be pregnant by David, he tries to trick her husband because she's married. And when that doesn't work, he has the husband killed. Then this is the man after God's own heart, right? Do you see a problem here? Yes. What happened? David had been successful. He had been humble. You can read all about his adventures. They're phenomenal. They're great. And he was humble. He served the Lord day after day faithfully, even at the peril of his own life. But when David ascended to the king and there was nobody left to kind of take it from him, he relaxed. And what did he do when he relaxed? He saw. Now, at the point where he saw Bathsheba, nothing's wrong yet. Okay? Because there are times in your life, and you know this to be true, you can't help what you see. Just walk down the aisles at Walmart. You can't help what you see. Right? Unless you just don't go to Walmart. Right? I mean, seriously, I have seen some people dressed at Walmart that's like, what are they doing? Anyway, So David's at his house, and he's looking around in the afternoon, and he sees Bathsheba, and she's taking a bath. Right? At this point, nothing has happened. But what we see from this point forward, everything David does is wrong. And what happens? It's pride. I want her. I will have her. I will take her, and she will do whatever I say. And then when it turns out to not go exactly like David happens, well, I will get her husband, and he will sleep with her and cover my mess up. And when he doesn't, well, then I'm the king. I'll just have him killed, and nobody will know about this. But what happens? What is God? All-knowing. See, you know what God does? God tells this guy named Nathan to go talk to David. Nathan has no idea what has gone on until the Lord kind of lets him in it. And Nathan confronts David. Now, thankfully, David sees the error of his ways, and he repents in that moment. But listen to me. From the moment with Bathsheba forward, David's kingdom is never the same. In fact, if you really want to pinpoint when the golden age kind of starts to lack the luster just a little bit, it's in that moment. That's the pinnacle, and that doesn't mean it's not good for the rest of David's life, but it's not the same. And it doesn't mean Solomon doesn't do some good, because he does, David's son. But you can see that we're kind of at the peak, and we're kind of going down. And frankly, it goes down rather quickly. Now, that doesn't mean there's not high notes after it goes down. There's some great guys. We'll talk about one in a minute. But the reality is the kingdom of Israel is never the same. David's reign is never the same. Why? Pride. God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. Period. End of discussion. And Hannah shows that to us through this story today. Here's the second point. And it comes from verse number 8, the last part. Kind of the last little phrase there. What Hannah says is, for the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. So remember, we just said that God is omniscient. He is all-knowing. Well, what Hannah says here is, he is all-powerful. What was that other word we used? Omnipotent? Omnipotent? However you want to say it. He's all-powerful. And so what Hannah says is, he is all-knowing, and he is all-powerful. So he knows what's going on, and he knows whether you're proud or whether you're humble, but then he also is all-powerful. And look at how she describes God's power in action, and it comes in verses 9 and 10. Here are the highlights. He protects the faithful, breaks the adversary, and then gives strength to the king and exalts his anointed. Gives strength to the king, exalts his anointed, breaks the adversary, protects the faithful. Right? And so what she's saying is that God has the power to protect his people. Right? Now remember, this is somewhat contingent on the humility and the pride thing, right? But God has the ability to protect his people, to care for them, to provide for them, and all that. Let me give you one example from way after David in the life of King Hezekiah. Hezekiah was one of the kings who did right in the sight of the Lord. He was not perfect. He made a couple bad decisions. But overall, Hezekiah is judged to be a good king. His story is in 2 Kings 18 through 20 or 2 Chronicles 29 through 32. Here's kind of the point I want to highlight in this part of Hezekiah's reign. Hezekiah is king when the Assyrians, remember I mentioned the Assyrians a minute ago, who annihilated the 10 northern tribes of Israel and took them away and never returned. Well, after that, the king of Assyria named Sennacherib puts his sight on Judah, on Jerusalem. And I mean, natural idea for him. He's conquered part of them. Now he's going to conquer next. He's pretty much conquered the world, the known world at this time, right? And so this little podunk kingdom of Judah, no big deal. So Sennacherib, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, comes and surrounds, is setting up a siege, which basically means either they're going to surrender, or we're going to knock down the walls, or we're going to starve them out. It may take 2 years, but oh well. And so he starts setting up this siege. And he sends people to the wall to basically defame God and Hezekiah and tell them they're dumb and they're stupid. Your God doesn't have any power and nothing. And what does Hezekiah do? He really has a couple of choices, right? One, he can do nothing. Two, he can surrender, but he doesn't do either of those. The story tells us, the text tells us, that Hezekiah runs to the temple that Solomon, his forefather, built. Runs to the temple, and the text tells us that he literally grabs the altar where they offered sacrifices, had like horns sticking out on it. And he literally grabs the horns of the altar and prays. Basically, beseeching, begging, like, God, if you don't show up, we are all going to die. Right? And this idea of him running and grabbing onto the horns of the altar was known as a way of crying out in desperation to the Lord. And so Hezekiah, he doesn't know what else to do. He turns to the only person he knows can help. And because of his desire to come after the Lord, God shows up in great power. In fact, the text tells us that God sends an angel to go down in the midst of the Assyrian camp, and the next morning Sennacherib wakes up, and I think the text says 185,000 Assyrian soldiers are dead. Like that. So what does Sennacherib do? He packs up and goes home and doesn't come back. Now you say, wow, that's amazing. That's a crazy story. Yeah, it is. But what happened? Hezekiah had a choice to make. Am I going to trust in the all-powerful, omnipotent God that we serve? Or am I going to turn to my generals and my army? Are we just going to wait it out? Are we going to make a deal with him? How are we going to do this? And so what we see is that when God's people are humble, then the pillars of the earth are Lord's, and on them he has set the world, and therefore he is the creator, sustainer of life, and he protects the faithful and breaks the adversary and gives strength to the king and exalts his anointed. Right? And so those are the two lenses, or the two parts of the lens through which we read the rest of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And you will see some stories of, especially using this lens, where you reading the story, you're like, this ain't gonna end good. And what happens? It don't end good. It don't. And then you can say, oh, this is gonna end good. And it ends good, right? And so we read these stories, and as I've said multiple times, probably over the last year or so, that when we read the Bible, we should read it for information's sake, to learn, to increase our breadth of knowledge. But that's not the only way we should read the Bible, because the Bible is not just a history book, right? But it is God's inspired, inerrant, infallible, authoritative, sufficient word for our lives. And so what we should do, like we do every week, is when we read the Bible, we should ask, how does this work with me? Like, how does this apply to my life? Like, what point is God trying to convey to me? And when we read Kings and Chronicles and Samuel, I can't help but ask questions that reflect on my own life. For example, question I had this week was, like, what would, we had a dear friend, one of our ministry friends lost a dear friend in their church this week, tragically. One of his daughters was a good friend of ours. Just in a moment, got hit by a car, died on impact. Tragic, awful. But in the moment of reading this, kind of knowing that, here's the question I have. All of these kings have an epitaph, right? They did right beside the Lord, they did evil side. Like, what would mine be? Like, what would mine be? Like, you can't help but read king after king. They did right, they did evil, they did right, they did evil, they did evil, they did evil, they did evil. What would mine be? Like if somebody was writing my biography, like, what would my epitaph be right now? I know what I'd like for it to be, but is that what it is? And if you know what you'd like for it to be, but if you look and say that's not what it is now, then you got to take some steps to get where you want to be. Right? What would my epitaph be? What would I do if I was faced by the Sennacherib of my life? Would I run to the horn of the altar? Do I bow up, poke my chest out? What do I do? Do I worship idols in my life like a lot of the Israelites did, which caused trouble in there? I'm not talking about little statues I got in my house, but do I worship other things more than I do God? Those are some questions that I don't think you can get around, or questions like that you can get around when you read these chapters. And so, as I was thinking, there's three that I think we really need to kind of hone in today, and two of them go with our teaching points. One's kind of a forward-looking one. But here we go. So here's some application, 3 touch points I think you got to ask when you read this chapter, when you look through the lens that Hannah presents us. Here's kind of application point number 1 in the form of a question. Where is pride at in my life? Where is pride at in my life? The Bible references the word pride 50 times or more, at least 50 times. The only ones, listen to me, the only ones that have any remote positive tinge to them are the ones where people are proud of God's work in someone or someone's else. That's the only time. Every other reference of pride has a negative connotation. So the question then becomes, where am I harboring pride in my life? Because we've seen clearly God opposes the proud, gives grace to the humble. So therefore we've got to ask the question, what am I proud about that is not related to God's work in my life or someone's else? Where is pride? What level of pride do I have? A couple other things real quick, talking about pride. Pride, and if you want to look at it from a New Testament sense, in Mark 7:22, Jesus lists pride as one of the sins that defiles a person. If you look at that list, there's probably some sin. You wouldn't put pride in that in the category with some of the others, because for us, they're like, murder, pride. A little bit different, right? Not for the Lord. 1 John 2:6, so John, a disciple of Jesus, 1 John 2:16, includes the pride of life as being that which is not from God, but from the world. Why is pride so bad? In essence, when you have pride in your life, you are becoming the arbiter of destiny and control and not God. Right? Silly illustration, right? If pride is like when you go out and you play baseball, or like you grow tomatoes and you're like, man, I grew those tomatoes. Yeah, I did. No, you didn't. You didn't make them grow. What you did was you took a seed and you put it in the ground, and now you might have put dirt around it, and you might have started it in like January in your greenhouse, but you didn't make the thing grow. Because if you've gardened any in your life, you know what happens. You can do the same thing to 2 same plants that you did everything similar to, and one grows and the other doesn't, and you're left like, what happened? You didn't control the growing. You nurtured it maybe at best, but you didn't make it grow, right? God did. He made it grow, right? So whenever we have pride in our life, we exchange places with God. And we become the arbiters of life and destiny and change and all that. When in reality, God is the moving agent in all of those. So first question is, where is pride at in your life? Number 2, am I being faithful to God? Right? Am I being faithful to God? Am I being like Hezekiah or Jehoshaphat or even David when confronted with sin in my life? Am I repenting of it like David? Or am I like Hezekiah, running to the altar of God, turning to Him? Am I like Jehoshaphat, following the counsel of the Lord in battle? Right? Are we being faithful to God? That's the second question. Here's the third one. When you read Hannah's passage, you got to remember the time in which Hannah writes it, right? So she writes it after she's given Samuel over to Eli to be raised in the house of the Lord, to be a servant of God. He ends up being like a prophet, priest type person, leader of Israel. But you got to remember, she writes this poem before there is a king. Okay? many years before there is a king. Saul, the first king of Israel, doesn't come around till years down the road. And so when you read this last line, read it with me again in verse number 10. He will give strength, God will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. Right? Now here's what, remember we were talking about reflecting as you read and asking questions? Yes, absolutely. That last sentence is meant to be a very close foreshadowing for the kings that were to come. Like Saul, like David, like Solomon, like Hezekiah, Jehoshaphat, Josiah, and all these others, right? We go down the list. Yes, that is meant to be a very near foreshadowing. But I cannot help but see another foreshadowing that is further down the road. Right? And when the king comes, the king, not a king, the King of Kings, Jesus. Like I can't help but see, even in Hannah's poem, song of rejoicing, I can't see but just a glimmer of light that shines all the way to the person and work of Jesus. So when I read this story, and then you read the subsequent acts of the king, some of them are atrocious. One of them, his name is Manasseh, the worst king of all. Right? You know what he did? He actively promoted idol worship. That's bad. Awful, right? But you know what else he did? He picked up a very pagan practice of, listen to me, parents, child sacrifice. Where you took a baby, an infant, a kid, and you literally killed them and offered them to a fake pagan god. Right? And see, I can't help but wonder, amidst the good, the bad, and the ugly, I can't, if I'm in the shoes of the Israelites at that day, I can't wonder, like, when's the real king coming? Like, there's got to be somebody better, right? Like, look, you do this today. Okay? When you put, voting is starting soon, right, for local elections and state and all this kind of stuff, and you're going to vote in a primary for governor and right? And here's what's going to happen for some of us. It happens every year. Maybe not, I don't know, I'm not worried about how you vote. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to push the button for somebody, and some of us in here, your person who you voted for is not going to get elected. And then the other person's going to get elected. And you're not going to like the other person. Because they make terrible decisions. Right? Boo, hiss, boo. And then you're going to go around and say, I told y'all that person wasn't going to do right. And here's in your mind what you're going to think. Well, I'm waiting on the next person. Because they're going to be better than this person. Right? You do it every time. All the way down. They shouldn't have won this school board. They're not any good. They never whatever. I don't know. I told you that guy was going to be bad for governor. The president's terrible. We'll get him next time, right? That's what we do. I can't help but think that that's exactly what Israel did. And when we read this last little section from Hannah, and she says, he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn, I can't help but look to the one king who would right all the wrongs done in the world, who would die on a cross and rise again, and who would literally be the answer to God's promise to Abraham that through you, the whole world will be blessed. And that comes in the person of Jesus Christ. And we know all of that right now. So the last question that I can't help but ask myself as I read this story is, am I still looking for a king? Am I still looking for a king? Right? Because you say, well, what do you mean? Like, am I still looking for a king? Well, we got Jesus. Surely he does. But here's what we do in life, right? Here's what we do. We go out and we look for fulfillment and satisfaction and a sense of being full from someone other than Jesus. Right? So we go out and we live life and we do all this stuff and we have, and then we realize what we have is it makes us happy, and so we get more and we get more, or then we go the other extreme, we're like, all this stuff's making me upset, so we get less. And what we find is that we're never fulfilled, and we're never truly satisfied. Why is that? Because you're still looking for a king of fulfillment. But what we need to realize is that person has already come in Jesus Christ. And he is the one who fulfills and satisfies and fills up every nook and cranny of our life and our heart. And he is the one who gives us ultimate fulfillment and peace and satisfaction, and not anything else. Right? That's why you see stories of all of these famous, rich people who seemingly have everything, who are miserable. Because what we realize is and we realize in this could have been another point that we could have made, that having stuff doesn't solve your problems. In fact, it creates more problems. Solomon he was the wisest person in the world at the time. The Bible says no one was wiser than him before or after. Wisest person. He was a king. He had all the gold and silver he could want. He had all the women he could want. He had the military he wanted. And at the end of his life, here's what he says in Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. It's all vain. It's worthless. Everything. Here's a person who had everything and still felt the emptiness without satisfaction in God. She's still looking for a king. Satisfaction, that's one area. Help. You know what? There are 1,000 self-help books and things you can turn to, and you need to talk to your friends, but you need to make sure you're picking the right friends to talk to.
That's right.
Come on now. You need to make sure you're picking the right friends to talk to. Because if you ain't talking to the right friends, them friends who ain't the right ones to talk to, they can lead you down a very wrong path. And you will still be trying to find the answer to your help decades later, because you didn't ask the people who were centered in Christ, who've already found the king, who are going to help you find the king in your situation. Teenagers, adults, and that's not just for, like, a lot of times we like to point that at kids, people who you hang around, who you going to be when you grow up, but that goes for us as adults too. Because we ask some people questions that they're not capable of answering, because we're not even in the same ballpark spiritually, relationally with the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have a relationship with Him, but for deep, pressing questions in your life, you need to ask people who have a deep-seated relationship with the Lord, because they're the people that hopefully are going to lead you in the right direction, because over time, they have seen God work and work and work and work and work, right? Help, purpose, right and wrong. I mean, there's 1,000 other ways we can play this out. The question becomes, are you still looking for a king for this area or that area of your life, or are you satisfied in that you have found the king in Jesus Christ? Right? So those are just 3 touch points that I think land, or we must ask ourselves as we read through the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles through the lens of God's omniscience, in that He knows and He judges humility and pride, and through the lens of God's omnipotence, that He blesses the righteous and He protects them, and He breaks those who are wicked and evil. And so through that lens, those are just 3 things. There's a lot other that we could talk about. So, every week we kind of have a challenge, and we kind of end our time that way, because I like to go out like having a goal to work toward, and so that's why we kind of end our time this way every week. And so really simply, we're going to have a time of response here in a minute where Pastor Joe's going to come up, Miss Ruby's going to play, and we're going to have our invitation time. But as we do, here are kind of the 3 challenge points I would like to think about this week, and really they're the questions we just asked. Where is pride at in my life? We've already noted that God opposes pride. I don't want to be opposed by God. And I know you don't either. So we got to deal with pride in our life in every way. Am I being faithful to God? Am I running to seek God's counsel, His plan, His provision? Or am I trying to find it some other way? And lastly, have I found the one true King in Jesus? Or am I still searching for someone else? And those are some questions. Listen to me. You can answer them today, but because of the way life works, you're going to need to answer them again on Wednesday. Or maybe this afternoon. Frankly. Right? This isn't a one and done. Like, this is a daily, as we move closer to Christ, as we start from here and we walk toward Jesus, these are some things that we're going to daily have to deal with in our life. Where is pride at in our life? Am I being faithful to Jesus today? I know I was yesterday, but that's gone and done. Or I wasn't yesterday, but that's over. So what am I doing today? Am I being faithful to God today? And am I letting Jesus be king in my life today over this circumstance, right? Because every day is different, and the challenges of each day are massively unique. And so these are questions, these are challenges we need to have in front of us every single. Where's pride? Am I being faithful? And have I found the king? All right, pray with me. Lord, thank you so much for your grace and mercy. Lord, I know we pray that each and every week, but Lord, without your grace and mercy, and without your Spirit being prevalent in our life, Lord, we would be without hope, without a future, and Lord, we would be in chaos and separated from you. But because of your grace and mercy, because of who you are and what you do in the hearts and lives of people, Lord, I pray, Lord, I am thankful just Lord, for everything that you do for us. And Lord, we are here today because of it. So Lord, as we go into this time of response and this time of activating the challenge that we've set for us, Lord, I pray that we would do that. And wherever you need to work in our hearts and lives, Lord, I pray that you would do that today. That you would move and work so that we can be drawn closer to you. So that today we can take a step closer to you. Lord, that this will be a catalyst so that we look back years from now and can say, on this day, Lord, we began rapidly moving closer to Jesus. Lord, I pray that that will be today. In your name we pray.